This has become a massive crisis in my country. 70,000 Canadians have been killed by doctors and nurses in hospitals and in private homes. Is prematurely ending a human life an adequate way to address the person's suffering?
Hello, Amanda. It is great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Amanda, why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Peter. My name is Amanda Achtman, and I'm a Canadian, and I am completely focused on preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope across Canada. This has become a massive crisis in my country where, since legalization, 70,000 Canadians have been killed by doctors and nurses in hospitals and in private homes. And so, my hope is that I can issue a bit of a warning to the UK of the path not to go down because this has proven to be quite a disaster in my home country.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. For those who are unaware, in the UK, the House of Commons will be debating Kim Ledbetter's private members bill, which is a bid to introduce legislation around assisted suicide here in the UK. Well, Amanda, take us back to, was it 2016 when Canada first introduced euthanasia? What were the advocates for it saying in favor of it back then? Because it'd be really interesting to hear whether it's similar to what people in the UK are saying now.
That's right. So when Canada first legalized euthanasia nationwide in 2016, it was largely in reaction to Supreme Court decisions. And so people advocating to be able to have a doctor or nurse end their life due to extreme suffering and agony. And so, because of these various court decisions, Parliament was given a deadline to enact a law. And the law that Parliament enacted created an exception in our criminal code, specifically under the criminal code section related to homicide, so that a
Mm.
doctor or nurse, when following certain rules and criteria, would not be held criminally responsible for homicide in the case of doing what we call in Canada MAID, which stands for medical assistance in dying. And so this was how it was enacted, and this was ushered in nationwide that year. And I started paying attention to this rather early on, partly because
Mhm.
at the time my grandfather was living in the home with my family, and I was in high school and my first years of university back then. And I realized that the euthanasia law was being brought in specifically for those whose deaths were deemed reasonably foreseeable. And at
Mhm.
the time that my grandfather was with us, he was in his late 80s and early 90s. And so I immediately had the sense, well, this is people like him. His death is pretty reasonably foreseeable. I mean,
Yeah.
naturally, all of our deaths are foreseeable, but especially for someone in his 80s and in his 90s. And he certainly
Yeah.
had times where he expressed that he wasn't sure that he, especially after a difficult surgery or when he was in a great deal of pain, he
Mm.
would express thoughts of kind of wanting to die, and I saw that unfold through my visits and through my closeness with him, and I also
Mm.
realized that was an experience at a certain time, but very often after some weeks or some months he would have a different kind of attitude and those thoughts would have passed. And so I just saw the capacity for great risk and harm to people in their moments of particularly acute vulnerability to fall prey and
Mm.
susceptible to euthanasia rather than receiving the care and support and patient accompaniment to which they are genuinely entitled.
Yeah. And actually, that's something so important there, isn't it? That the idea that people change their minds because you might be in the midst of suffering, and one day that might be worse than on another day. Just to go back to something which you said in that, Amanda, you mentioned that this was for people who had deaths which were foreseeable. You also talked about reducing suffering. And that is something which is, I think, right at the heart of the debate here in the UK. Is this a legitimate way through which suffering might be reduced. How did the debate go in when it happened in Canada? So obviously we know what the result was, but what were some of the key arguments? I'm one thing I'm particularly interested in is did those who were pro introducing assisted suicide or euthanasia, did they try and write off some who were against it as sort of being particularly religiously motivated, or what were some of the key arguments in that debate?
Sure. So particularly because of how euthanasia was brought in, first of all, the court decision and then the
Mm.
push by Parliament, I would say we weren't really having a national conversation about it. It was
Gosh, yeah.
mainly from the courts and from the politicians, and I wouldn't say that it was a dominant topic of discussion or that we had a big national conversation in the media. Not even to
Mm.
the extent that I'm seeing right now in the UK. And so it was largely driven by a campaign group which does have its analogous organizations in across our countries. And this euthanasia lobby group in Canada has been active for more than 40 years. And as their mission states that their goal is to remove unwanted suffering. And
Mm.
since most suffering is unwanted, they found a relatively captive audience. We
Yeah.
don't want to suffer naturally. And so the contention is not over um, whether or not we should let people suffer. I'm often asked, well, do you believe we should just let people suffer? Well, of course
Mm.
not. That's not, we're not masochists here. The question
Yeah.
is prematurely ending a human life an adequate way to address the person's suffering? Does it really
Yeah.
address suffering? And so I think those who would say no say we ought to do better.
Mm.
Your last like basically one of the ways that we would speak about it very often in pushing back is that your worst day should not be your last day. And
Mm.
what this does, what ushering in legal euthanasia does, is it creates a two-tier society where some people, young people like us, who are relatively healthy and seem to have things going for us, if we went into a hospital, we would be offered suicide prevention. If we
Yeah.
expressed some degree of suicidal ideation or some self-harming behaviors, we would surely be offered suicide prevention. Whereas someone
Mm.
older, maybe someone with a disability, they are offered suicide assistance. And to really drive this home, I
Mm.
want to share the story about a very good friend of mine.
Yeah.
And this is even before the euthanasia expansion that expanded euthanasia to persons with disabilities, really. She is about my age, and she went into the hospital, and she was a single woman, alone, and pretty sick as she tells the story. And when the doctor came over to see her, the doctor said, "Whatever you have, it's really affecting your breathing, and so if it comes to it, you might need oxygen. Is that
Mm.
something you would want?" And my friend was like, "Well, duh, yes."
Yeah.
And then the doctor
Yeah.
followed it up with a second later. She said, "Are you sure?" And my friend
Gosh.
said, "Apparently, I qualified for an end to my life right there. I know I must
Yeah.
have looked kind of miserable and pitiable, but I was the same person in that hospital room as as I was the week before at university or at
Yeah.
work." And the thing is, those experiences stay with people.
Yeah.
Having the sense of being devalued, dismissed, and discarded leaves
Mm.
a permanent scar and is deeply wounding. And that's why I
Mm.
really want to drive home the point that just to be offered euthanasia, and not even to be offered it, just to know that you qualify for assisted suicide
Mm.
already kills the person. It already
Yeah.
defeats and deflates a sense of value. That's why it's not neutral, because there's a social message. If everyone with a terminal illness in the UK who has 6 months left to live, if they all know that they are eligible or qualify, these are sinister
Mm.
terms to use, for a doctor ending their life, that actually writes off that whole demographic. You
Yeah.
cannot have a policy by which some people are eligible for a premature ending of their life and not have it have a social consequence on everyone who fits the criteria.
Mm. Yeah.
That's why it's so important that if someone thinks, well, this is just an autonomous, independent choice, I say no. The very fact of having criteria sends a social message that there is a class of persons who qualify or are eligible not to exist.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's really helpful. Because that sort of speaks into one of the narratives which we have over here, where some people might say, well, if you don't want an assisted death, well, then you don't have to have it. But actually, what you're saying is it's speaking against that. Merely being offered something suggests that society thinks that your life is not worth living anymore.
And doctors get used to it. So, for example, take a condition that's a common one, for example, that leads people to request euthanasia. The underlying medical conditions or specific illnesses that are leading people to request euthanasia are, of course, cancer and
Yeah.
ALS and these kinds of things. Well, let's say that 9 out of 10 persons with ALS opt for assisted death. Is
Mm,
that 1 out of 10 who doesn't want it really
mm,
free? Because
yeah.
when 9 out of 10 persons are going through with it, that person is regarded as selfish,
Mm,
foolish. It is not a matter of indifference. It leaves that person much more precarious than they would have possibly been otherwise. And so that is, I think, a very crucial point that once people get habituated to excluding persons on certain grounds, then it really runs amok.
you mentioned a couple of times that Canada began with certain criteria, but you've also alluded to the fact that some people are now eligible for an assisted suicide who wouldn't have been eligible originally. Could you just trace out for us sort of what has the progression been? Where did you start with the criteria, and then where has it gone after that point?
Sure. So when euthanasia was first legalized, there were requirements that a person's death be reasonably foreseeable, which, as you can imagine, is rather subjective, but
Yeah,
nevertheless, it was a criterion. And then that the person be suffering a grievous and irremediable condition, also again
yeah,
prone to some subjective interpretation, but trying to pick up on that point of suffering and giving some credence to the patient's own experience. And that the person be over 18 and uh, available and that the person be entitled to public health care, these kinds of things, which are all quite similar to the one in the UK bill, to the criteria in the UK bill. What happened was that when this was when euthanasia was legalized in 2016, part of the legislation required that there be a 5-year statutory review, and
hmm,
this review got delayed for various reasons because of a federal election and other reasons. And fewer than 5 years after legalization, another bill was introduced. It was called Bill C7. And this was a euthanasia expansion bill to even
mm,
expand euthanasia beyond that initial criteria. And here's why. Once a society accepts euthanasia as a legitimate means to end suffering, it cannot remain limited. And here's
mm,
why. If it is a good and reasonable means of ending suffering, why would you restrict it to certain demographics? How
yeah,
is that not cruel? And so if euthanasia, if assisted dying is a means of ending suffering that's compassionate, there are really no grounds to limit it to adults. Why would you deprive children of this relief? And many in
yeah,
Canada are arguing along those lines. Similarly, why would you restrict euthanasia to those who are only suffering physically? We know that many
yeah,
people suffer psychologically in ways that torment them and in ways that surpass any physical suffering that a person can imagine. And so
mm,
once a society accepts euthanasia as a legitimate means to end a person's suffering, it cannot remain limited, but rather will always be expanded on the grounds of equality. And that's what we
yeah,
saw. It was billed as a lack of equality that people suffering physically but not mentally could get it, that
mm,
people suffering who were terminally ill but not living with a disability that rendered them in a similarly kind of precarious condition throughout their life couldn't get it. And so that's why it's so crucial to get to the bottom of whether or not assisted suicide is a public good or
yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Just to kind of see the way in which that's shifted so quickly. Do you think Britain would be any different? Because that is one of the things which, again, people in Britain do say is with a sort of kind of classic British exceptionalism. Well, of course, we're not like them over there. Do you think that Britain would be any different to what you have seen in your country?
I don't know what there is in Britain that would prevent persons from raising objections to the criteria being exclusive and discriminatory.
Yeah, yeah,
Surely you care about discrimination just as much as we do, maybe
yeah.
even more. And as soon as it is billed as a kind of discrimination against certain
Mm,
demographics who are restricted from accessing what becomes tantamount to a sort of right, even if it's not called a right, if it's a public service and it's a part of healthcare, then there's a basis for exclusion of access.
mm,
That becomes a problem. And so I
mm,
would say to proponents, if it's a good, again, why would it be restricted to any demographic? And how can that not be regarded as time goes on as discriminatory? What would you say to
mm.
someone who petitions in that way and says, I am being discriminated against and I am going to push for this on the grounds of my fundamental human equality? It's very difficult to argue against.
Yeah, sort of once I guess once you've let the principle go, well then as you say, I mean it's not fair to kind of discriminate against one group or another. Well, again, one of the things which we hear in the UK is that an assisted suicide legislation would be something which was rarely used. Not that many people would go for it, but that's not been the experience in Canada, has it? I saw a statistic recently, which is it sort of like 4% of all deaths now? It's something quite high, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly, it was expected that euthanasia would be a last resort and would
Yeah.
be exceptional. And it has gone, as one scholar put it recently, from exceptional to routine. And I would even say that it's not so much even routine as it is idealized, romanticized, and glamorized as the
Mm,
ideal way to die. This has become seen as a kind of progressive and developed way to end life. Why would you suffer and die naturally when you could choose at a certain age or at a certain stage that your life is that you've lived a completed life, as some people would put
yeah.
it. And so now, yes, 5% of all deaths in Canada are euthanasia. In certain parts of the country, it's much higher. So, for example, Vancouver Island is the euthanasia capital of the entire world. And in the last quarter, 11.4% of all deaths on the island were euthanasia. And it's now tied as the fifth leading cause of death in Canada.
Mm,
And again, all of these numbers rather cease to shock people once they become kind of enamored with euthanasia as
mm,
actually an ideal. And so I would also challenge those in the UK who are insisting that it will be rare. If it's
mm,
good, why would you want it to be rare? If it's
mm,
compassionate, why would it be a last resort? That doesn't make any
yeah.
sense. And so these really come down to our fundamental values, what it means to be human. And I would
Mm,
also like to make the point that if assisted dying is death with dignity, then what is
mm,
dying naturally?
mm,
Is this not a form of death shaming when people
mm,
die in all kinds of natural ways that are perhaps repulsive to us? I
mm,
will not shy away from saying that unfortunately we don't always have the courage to stand in the face of suffering and death, but we ought to. We ought to.
yeah.
We who pride ourselves in being so advanced and so sort of socially progressive, we cannot, if we cannot stand and face a person
Mm,
in their weakness and vulnerability, then this is a sign of our cowardice and of our
yeah.
kind of moral tepidity. And I think we have got to restore our sense of the nobility of protecting the weak and having
Mm,
reverence for those who are on their deathbed rather than saying, I want nothing to do with this. In a certain sense, I think that assisted dying has become death for a social media age. It's a
mm,
15-minute appointment where everyone can
yeah.
gather around. You have a glass of champagne, you play a certain soundtrack, and you can make a reel out of it. But
Mm,
actually, if we haven't lived real lives, if you're not living and dying in a way that has a depth to it that you can't broadcast, then you're actually
mm,
missing out on so
yeah.
much that is eminently human. And so I would also
Mm,
encourage people to think about, what are you cutting short? And how does assisted dying short circuit opportunities to love? That's on the human and
mm,
existential plane. But even more than that, or even aside from that, what do we lose in terms of technological progress and scientific innovation if we concede and capitulate to diseases and illness rather than trying to treat them? We're talking about our countries, which are some of the most developed countries in the entire world. What about all the people in the rest of the world who are dying
mm,
naturally and who are never going to go for this? They're
yeah.
counting on us to improve technology, improve scientific advances. And if we say, oh no, what we do is we answer by ending the person's life, they're going to look at
Mm,
us as being in dereliction of our duty to lead the way, not only
yeah.
culturally speaking, but really scientifically and medically speaking.
Yeah. No, it is really dystopian, isn't it? Uh, there is quite a lot of concern here in the UK about the impact on vulnerable communities. What has the impact of the medical assistance in dying, the MAID program, been upon the disabled community in Canada, or has there been an impact on those living in poverty as well? That'd be really interesting if you could speak into that.
Yeah, there are so many things to say about that. There was recently a report that came out about marginalized persons and euthanasia. But what I would want to stress there is that everyone who is euthanized is marginalized.
Mm,
Literally, it's the definition of the term to be peripheral, to be, again, discarded, dismissed, or discounted is the epitome of marginalization. And so I don't think we can so easily separate a person into the category of
yeah.
vulnerable and not vulnerable. In fact, we are all, as some disability advocates put it, temporarily able-bodied. We all
Yeah.
live seasons of vulnerability throughout our lives. And so part of the rupture in our public life and social discourse in these issues is this kind of two-tier or class-divided society between the vulnerable and the invulnerable. There was recently a euthanasia doctor who tried to insist, oh, it's not marginalized people who are coming to me for this. It's, as she said, it's the elites like us.
Mm,
And it may be that many of the proponents of euthanasia are those who are so attached to their sense of autonomy and
yeah.
control. Those are big motivators. But the ones who suffer the consequences of that mentality are certainly, especially persons with disabilities, persons living
Yeah.
with poverty. You could find, by this point, hundreds, if not thousands, of articles of Canadians with um, disabilities being offered euthanasia unsolicited, of persons with inadequate housing or with housing insecurity who certainly don't qualify for assisted dying on that basis. They have some other
Mm,
condition, and they will say, as for example, one man, Amir Farsood, told his doctor that he feared eviction, but he was approved by that very doctor on the grounds of his disability to
yeah.
be euthanized. But he had explicitly told his doctor that the grounds on which he was really applying was because of his fear of homelessness. Now, eventually, this is a positive story because people caught wind of his story and crowdfunded and he received so much support from the community. But I do want to warn that when you have healthcare by crowdfunding, as we're seeing in
Mm,
Canada, it is devastating for so many
mm,
people who are not able to drum up that level of support. And what the heck? We have publicly funded healthcare systems, and as I always say, you bet there better be better to offer than death with this. When suicide is government assistance, I'm not buying it. That is
yeah,
a massive, massive failure. It
yeah.
is a declaration of failure on the part of any government. I would say that equally of any government from any political stripe that says what we have to offer people is suicide. That's not going to cut it. That is not a
Mm,
real offer or real choice. People deserve more and better. And I truly believe that the rising generation is not going to stand for this, is not going to tolerate it, and is not going to settle for it. And so that becomes a real basis for hope.
mm. And well, we've talked about how assisted suicide is not the answer. What do you think we should be doing to support people who are approaching the end of their lives or who are in the midst of suffering? What would a good society look like?
I'm so glad you asked that. That's such a worthwhile question. I want to point out how the government does an annual survey and an annual report. Um, and in this report, the government documents the leading reasons that people request euthanasia by their own admission. And this is ranked as various kinds of suffering. The
Hmm.
main kind of suffering by people's own admission seeking euthanasia that lead them to make the request is not pain or the fear of pain, not loneliness, not fear of being a burden, not financial. Those are all on the list, but they're not the top. They're not even the top two. The number one reason why Canadians are asking for euthanasia is because they say they have lost the ability to engage in meaningful life activities.
Mm,
Loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. Yes, they have other underlying conditions and illnesses, to be sure. Those are the grounds on which they're being qualified for this premature ending to their life. But what this survey is showing is that euthanasia is fundamentally not a medical crisis. It's an
mm,
existential crisis. And so
mm,
my challenge would be to consider the activities in your life that are meaningful. How meaningful, and consider the activities in your own life that are meaningful. How resilient is your sense of meaning against loss or illness or
yeah.
disability? Because what the big challenge is how do we fortify ourselves and how do we forge our character such that we are sufficiently resilient to see a meaning and value of our life when we're no longer productive, when we no
Mm,
longer have as many people coming around to see us, when we can no longer do the hobbies or traditions or trips that we used to do. And so I
yeah.
think the most important thing right now is an education toward resilience. And I will
Mm,
note that I travel all the time into many, many other parts of the world. And when I share with them in other countries that this is what I do, I work to prevent euthanasia and encourage hope, they are so stunned. And many people, whether it's in the Middle East or in certain countries in Africa or Asia, will say, wow, we have problems here, but we don't have that problem. And
yeah.
I think it's so striking that in places of war and famine and poverty and all kinds of conflicts, that this is not the temptation. There's so much effort to try and preserve life. And then
Mm,
persons in these countries will look to us and say, and there in your country, you're trying to end it? What is going on? So I think that's the key piece of the puzzle here. How do we make sure that we are sufficiently educated toward resilience? This
mm,
is a project of our lives. And this is why I'm so passionate about this topic, because euthanasia is not just one issue. It's not one social issue. It's every issue. It's the issue of whether or not it's good for me to be in the world. It's the question of
yeah.
whether or not it's good we exist after all. And on that basis, I can dedicate myself to it fully because these are the questions of ultimate significance that count so deeply for the rest of our lives.
Mm. Thank you, Amanda. I'm conscious that we're short on time. One final question. What would be your advice to the UK in this moment?
In this moment, I would encourage the UK to continue to have this vigorous public conversation because that is a very healthy thing to do on such a weighty question. And it takes time to hear all of the voices that deserve to be heard. In particular, I would say pay attention to the voices of those who are at greatest risk of being discarded, dismissed, or discounted. It's the least that we can do to pay close attention to those who would be most affected by this bill and who maybe don't have the resources to elevate their voices in the public square. So it's up to us to come close to people and to help amplify those stories more broadly. Have conversations with your loved ones and friends about these topics. And above all, I would say don't consider the lowest common denominator. Fix your eyes on the ideals. What are your real
Mm,
aspirations? How do you want to suffer and die? And what story do you want to give by how you undergo the things that you suffer, not only at the end of life, but throughout your life? Because I find that as soon as we come alongside someone and we ask, what do you have to teach me in this? People always
mm,
exceed and outdo themselves. People always become suddenly more magnanimous and they are
yeah.
filled with a greater courage than they might have had just a moment ago. And so ask people, who are your heroes? Who do you admire? Because in fact, there is no good story without suffering. There's no
Mm,
good story without suffering. We don't need to seek it, as an American writer I like very much puts it. We don't have to seek suffering. Enough is as good as a feast. But those who do not know how to suffer cannot
mm,
discover who and what they are. And so
yeah.
our generation, the younger generation, will be stunted. Our growth and development will be impoverished by assisted dying because we will be uh, cut short of so many opportunities to be called out of ourselves, to give ourselves, and to ultimately grow up. So, this
Mm.
is a real basis for a real appeal for intergenerational solidarity and to let people know that I'm watching how you die. So, make sure you do it well.
Fantastic. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so wonderful to have your wisdom on a whole range of different topics there. So a massive thank you. And for those who have been watching this here in the UK, please do have in mind in your prayers the debate next Friday. That's Friday the 29th, as that will be a massive moment potentially in our nation's history, as the country decides whether or not to go down a route to introduce assisted suicide or not. Amanda, thank you once again for joining us, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Peter.